Hello and welcome to Magala Foresight, and this is Mikael Mnasse, producer and host of the show. Today we are joined by Kjetil Tronvoll via Skype in Norway. Tronvoll is Professor of Conflict Studies based in Norway. Professor Tronvoll, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Earlier this year, you warned of a looming violent confrontation between TPLF, Tigray, and Prosperity Party, the federal government. Given the recent developments, how far have we come in terms of the escalation of the conflict?
Well, just the last few days, or just news this morning even, tells us that we are in the 11th hour, or if not closer, to a possible outbreak of an armed confrontation. We hear disturbing news about both troop movements and preparations, and also then calling for increased political sanctions towards TPLF and Tigray as we speak. So I am fearing that the window of opportunity to try to mitigate the crisis and to try to seek a dialogue track towards a peaceful resolution of the discord seems to be closing.
You also criticized most of the international actors of being oblivious to the fast deteriorating situation between Tigray and Addis Ababa. What has been the approach of the international community to this matter?
Well, I'm in no position to speak on behalf of the international community. That's a vast and heterogeneous group of actors. But as far as I have observed and also interacted with a number of representatives for bilateral or multilateral agencies over the last number of years, but more intensively over the last year, is that in any case, Ethiopia is not an exception in this regard when it comes to conflict processes, because it is extremely hard to engage international attention, international actors to intervene into a political domestic process, because you have the issue of sovereignty. So the international community, the diplomatic community, have kind of to sit back and observe only, and until it reaches a certain level of crisis, then one is obliged or forced to take a stand on it. In Ethiopia, what makes it more challenging is the extremely complex and convoluted nature of Ethiopian politics, and many of the international actors don't have the necessary level of knowledge to understand what's going on, because the political landscape of Ethiopia is always contradictory. You have positive processes parallel to negative trajectories, and outsiders obviously tend possibly to, at least certain bilateral actors and diplomats tend to emphasize the positive elements and neglecting the negative trajectories. And I think this has blindsided many actors, that the major reform processes taking place in 2018 and early 2019 kind of led many actors to take 2 or 4 steps back and lean back and relax and saying, well, okay, no, Ethiopia is home free. We don't have to think more about Ethiopian political challenges. And they were too late to understand that the transition has not transitioned yet into a new consolidated political setup. It is still in transition, and to what, we don't know. So it has taken quite some time before the key international actors have become aware of the seriousness of the current discord. And only, to be frank, yes, 1 or 2 or 3 of the key actors have known about it, but have understood the level of seriousness. But again, as I said, it is hard to act and intervene into domestic sovereign affairs of Ethiopia. But over the last week or 2, we see a much more international engagement from the international diplomatic community. And I think more or less every embassy in Addis now have communicated back to the home capitals to warn about the situation.
Ethiopia is a country of 100 million plus people, and any descent into violent conflict or civil war will surely have serious repercussions, not only for the country but also for the region and beyond.
That is true, of course, and Ethiopia has always been viewed as the stable, or not always, but over the last 20-25 years have been viewed as the stable anchor state in the Horn of Africa, one of the most troubled and conflict-prone areas of the world, having fragile states or collapsing state or states in transition on all fronts, in Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and certainly also in Eritrea. So the international community has relied upon Ethiopia as the stable anchor state of the Horn and to project stability to its neighbors too. So it is a serious worst-case scenario we might be approaching if Ethiopia is turning into instability and turmoil, because that will also affect the whole Horn of Africa region and beyond, not only in terms of a political crisis, but also a humanitarian crisis. And that is obviously a great concern for everyone, and it should be. But again, we have to stress the fact that international relations are organized based on the principle of sovereignty. And this is so far, this is a domestic Ethiopian problem. It doesn't directly involve international relations in terms of other actors engaging directly into the conflict in Ethiopia. Yes, one might question President Isaias Afwerki's involvement in Ethiopia, but he is in Ethiopia on invitation by the Ethiopian government. So it is not an aggressive stand by President Isaias Afwerki. He is in Ethiopia, and his engagement in Ethiopia is on invitation by the current government of Ethiopia. So the international community cannot use that as a pretext to say that this is an international crisis. So far, this is a domestic challenge, and hence the international community is more or less a lame duck. The only thing they can do is issue statements of concern of the situation.
And the fact that the group currently in power in Addis Ababa allowing an external power to wreak havoc internally and also being complicit in crushing one's own people by force, isn't that against international law?
You are presenting a political analysis of the situation, and you can agree or disagree with that. You know, the fact is that he is invited and in collaboration with the current federal government of your country. So as far as that is the modus operandi, it is little international law can inform us about that case. International community, other foreign actors cannot say that you have to stop to engage with President Isaias. You know, he is here upon your invitation by your government.
But isn't Isaias' interference in the internal affairs of Ethiopia a destabilizing factor?
No, that's certainly so. And that's a political analysis I can share, that I don't see any positive elements in President Isaias Afwerki's involvement in Ethiopia. But I can say that as a foreign researcher, it doesn't have any clout by international law, as long as your prime minister have a different opinion on that. But as far as we understand President Isaias Afwerki's objectives, and as far as and based on 30 years of understanding of him as president of Eritrea, he certainly had no previous empirical precedents that he's engaged in positive stability of Ethiopia.
You complained of some of the diplomats in Addis Ababa for ridiculing what you said, some of the early warning conflict mitigating appeals. Would you please shed some light on what these appeals were?
Well, as you are aware of, I have both written a number of kind of public Facebook posts, tweets, and also provided input and analysis to some of the international actors. I've also tried to engage on a personal note with other diplomats in trying to inform them about the situation as I analyze it. Earlier that was basically in many ways rejected by some. Others brought it on board in a way that we could have a constructive dialogue on these issues. You know, it's always, you know, up to any embassy, obviously, any foreign representation to define their understanding of the country they are working in. And what is generally not known by many in, you know, not engaging with an international community is that for a diplomatic representation, it is equally important not to know issues as there are to know issues. Because if you don't know it, you have an assumption that you don't need to act. And on many instances, with the complexities of politics in Ethiopia, it might be more safe, it might be more convenient not to know, because then you don't need to act.
This escalation is particularly evident since the regional elections in Tigray and what followed the mutual non-recognition by the two sides. You were in Tigray for the elections and you have observed 2.7 million turned out for the elections, and you saw how orderly and how peaceful it was. What basis can one have for labeling it illegal and unconstitutional?
You know, I don't take a stand on that, because that's about the legality or constitutionality of the election. It's I leave that up to Ethiopian constitutional experts to define. And for me, that is not relevant. I look upon the exercise as a political exercise and a political process and a manifestation of a political process, and that's why I was there, to analyze it within that context. I don't say it is illegal, I don't say it is legal. That's not up to me to have a stand on. I just make references to what the Ethiopian constitutional lawyers and what the federal authorities of vested with authority to have a stand on this says. But my point has been all the time, as a researcher on human rights, as a researcher on political development, as a researcher on conflict, is that to do research and observation of an event doesn't make it, that cannot be classified as illegal. You know, if you do that, then all human rights research is illegal, because violating human rights is a breach of law. You know, so that is nonsensical to say that you need to have the capacity and the openness for academic freedom to do research on controversial and contested issues. That's the reason that's there for a lot of research, in order to provide a broader understanding of the political processes. And hence that's the reason why I was in Tigray during the election, to understand that occurrence, that event, in the context of Ethiopia today.
The authorities in Addis Ababa have taken a series of punitive measures against Tigray, including halting the budgetary subsidies and also stopping the safety net support by the international donors. Isn't this against international law?
I will not make any concrete judgment on that, because I'm not an international lawyer. I'm not an expert of international law as such. But obviously, for any government to sanction large segments of its population and to block humanitarian assistance, for instance, or to block other necessarily funding or equipment for survival of a group of people, might breach at least several political norms, but also possibly humanitarian standards and other aspects of international law. That is a case which obviously I would believe your colleagues or authorities in the regional state of Tigray will look into. The political situation in Ethiopia today will not have its solution by legalizing it, by constitutionalizing it. It needs a political solution, and for a political solution to be reached, you need dialogue, and you need to enter into constructive political discussions to seek compromises which both sides or all sides can accept. And that compromise is not reached through legalizing a process.
The issue of the leadership of the Northern Command, which you consider a serious latest development, how do you think will play out if both sides don't come to some sort of peaceful resolution of this row?
I think that issue is the key issue which finally opened the eyes for many of the internationals, in a sense that until this time the contestation had been in the political realm, more or less as a political confrontation, but broadening then to also include more a civil component, a more people-to-people confrontation when you saw the sanctions of holding back or suspending development aid and so on to Tigray. But that final step is entering into the realm of the military structures of the country. And of course we know the past history of Ethiopia in terms of the military rule under the Derg junta, and the way the control of the armed forces is obviously a key to any state and to any stability of any state configuration. So I think that really was a wake-up call for many to see that this is really heading in the wrong direction. Again, I'm not taking any stand on that issue in itself. I observe that what the regional government of Tigray states, that any action, any political decision, any administrative decision taken by the federal government after October 5th is, from the view of Mekele, null and void. And of course, the federal government in Addis Ababa needs to continue governing the country as they see fit, because they do sit with the responsibility as the federal government. So it's if both sides stand steadfast on the issue as of today, well, I don't see any other way than a conflict in ending that situation. And hence again, the call for political dialogue in order to address that concern.
The call for political dialogue, which was made by the federalist forces, including the government of Tigray, government in Addis has not responded to that positively so far. What happens in such kind of situation? What needs to happen? Who will break the ice?
Well, I see, one thing is the call made by the multinational federalist forces, including TPLF. But that call had also a number of preconditions in order to enter into dialogue. So I think we will see a much stronger international engagement where you call for political dialogue, but a political dialogue, it's hard to get that started when both or all sides or one side have a very strict set of preconditions ahead of political dialogue. That's not necessarily the best way to kickstart such a process. And I think before a political dialogue can commence in Ethiopia today, you need to have a pre-dialogue, so to say, to settle the issues of the preconditions before you reach the phase of a substance dialogue.
But how can you organize a political dialogue when most of the leaders of the opposition political parties are behind bars, for instance? And there is the issue of legitimacy of the government in power now, and that there should be a neutral, technocratic government to lead the process.
I think it is a fair point to raise concern that many of the political leaders of opposition parties in Ethiopia are currently in detention and under charges of various kinds. And it will be difficult to reach or to include their parties or their constituencies in the dialogue process when the leaders are under arrest. That's a fair point that needs to be addressed, obviously. On the issue of the legitimacy of the federal government, that again is a political stand taken by TPLF and some other actors in the multinational federation. But as viewed internationally, the federal government of Ethiopia still holds international recognition and legitimacy, and that's the entry point from any kind of international engagement towards Ethiopia. So we need to distinguish also between a domestic political positioning and what the possibilities are for any kind of international engagement on this.
There are those who say that this conflict should be seen in a wider context, political context, that there are conflicts here and there in Ethiopia, and that it's not only between Tigray and those in power in Addis, but this is a conflagration of conflict everywhere, and that this should be the context from which to view this conflict between Tigray and the authorities in Addis.
Yes, certainly. I think, and just, hearing the terrible atrocities happening in Western Wolga just a couple of days ago, which is abhorrent in any perspective of it. The earlier incidents elsewhere in the country tells us that the political crisis in Ethiopia is not alone between TPLF and the federal government. It's much deeper, much more comprehensive, much more complex in terms of governance capacity, in terms of a social contract with the citizenship, in terms of an understanding of what Ethiopian statehood should be and how it should be configured, and so on and so forth. So the TPLF Prosperity Party discord is just the tip of the iceberg, you can say, is the manifestation of much deeper, much more challenging issues to be tackled. But this has to be addressed in organized and kind of an incremental fashion. You cannot manage to tackle all the challenging issues at once in the political dialogue. You first need to settle the more imminent threats to peace and stability before you can move on to discuss and to agree upon, or to agree to disagree upon, the more core issues of the Ethiopian political landscape.
You urged the international community to act before it is too late. Have we passed that threshold? Are we too late?
I don't want to answer realistically about that, because I'm that will be too pessimistic. So I can say I sincerely hope we are not too late, but I also need to stress that the issues of contestation and the challenges of creating a compromise the responsibility for that rests 100% with Ethiopian actors. The international community don't have a responsibility to settle Ethiopian conflicts. It is up to the Ethiopian political actors and the Ethiopian broader society who have that responsibility, so to say, to settle those issues. All the international community can do is try to help and facilitate, or to try to tweak the parties, so to say, to approach the negotiation table. And I think that is extremely important to keep in mind for all Ethiopian political actors and all Ethiopian citizens, that you yourself have to ask and demand for peace by your political leaders.
The administration in Addis Ababa, its approach to solving the problems in the country is being criticized by many as being coercive, and also making alliances with external forces to crush opposition inside the country. What's your view on this?
Well, I think what we've seen of developments over the last year and a half or two, since 2019, the spring of 2019, a year and a half back, is concerning, in the sense that and what I started your interview with is that yes, Ethiopia is transitioning is in transition, but we don't know what it is in transition to. It's way too early to conclude that Ethiopia is in a transition to democracy. And sadly, we have seen backsliding towards old authoritarian practices, and that has been reported by your own Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, for instance, in the sense of atrocities or human rights violations occurring in Ethiopia. And it has certainly been reported by many international agencies like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch too. And we have seen a resurgence of insurgency in Oromia, which harks back to former times. We have seen instability, as we said, in several parts of the country, manifesting that the transition, the governance structures are not capable of catering for stability, and that is not because that is not necessarily because they are weak. Because, as you also said, we have seen a stronger coercive policies, but it might be because the policies are not reflecting the interest or aspirations of the people, where you do see the troubled areas of Ethiopia. So I think, again, when I mentioned the issue of a social contract, that is probably the main challenge Ethiopia is facing, is that the social contract with many of its constituents are broken. That they don't feel represented in politics, that they don't feel represented at the center of politics, that they don't feel protected and safe. The Amhara sentiment, for instance, as far as I understand it now, after having done research over the last during the summer with many colleagues there, is a very deep-rooted fear, both individually and collectively, about their security, as we see, the incident 2 days ago, that they have not, that they're not represented regionally, their interest, or federally, and that you can tick off in several of the constituencies in Ethiopia. So I think that is the main challenge, that the governing structures need to develop and make sure that a new social contract with the citizenry of Ethiopia is established in order to pacify those local grievances, which are, as we see, translated into local armed confrontations, further destabilizing the country. And the more the center then try to use coercion to clamp down on this without listening to or trying to understand why these grievances are articulated in this way, the more these grievances will be strengthened. So hopefully that will be a awakening call also for decision makers at the center, that we don't repeat what has earlier happened in your country.
So the social contract you mentioned, it's encapsulated in the constitution, and the group in power has been violating the constitution, and also the governing structures that you said, the institutions have been overrun by unilateral tendencies, authoritarian decision making, lack of consultation between regions, among political parties. So don't you think this is the reason for the breakdown of the social contract?
Let me modify a bit there what you say, because I don't say that the social contract is encapsulated in the constitution, and we see parts of the grievances expressed by certain segments of the Ethiopian people is against the current constitutional framework. So not everyone feel aligned or feel that constitutional framework embodies their aspirations. But be that as it may, I think a social contract is certainly to establish that firmly and to manage to establish a peaceful governance structure. The social contract between a government, be that both at the central level and regional levels, need to be aligned with the people's interests and aspirations. The responsibility to develop that rests with the authorities, obviously, and the responsibility to implement it rests with the authorities. And it is the people's rights and privileges to react through democratic means, to communicate their interests, and also to communicate the checks and balances back to the authorities that, well, now you are going astray from what we like to happen, to use that term. Of course, the main challenge, again, out of many, one of the key challenges in establishing such a more democratic social contract with the people of Ethiopia is that you have not had any democratic elections in the country, that you have not a tradition to vote and to vote people, parties, representatives out of power in that sense. And to establish that tradition, to establish that norm, you need to establish accountable institutions first who can organize and cater for and protect the full democratic rights needed to have an open and credible election. That takes a long time, no doubt about that. No one can expect Ethiopia to hold an open and credible and free and fair election next year, considering the current terrain and considering the current weakness of the institutional setup. But you should at least strive for taking a step forward in accommodating increasing levels of accountability and increasing levels of democracy in the institutional setup.
Abiy has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2019. Has he lived up to that?
Well, I need to arrest you. The current government has not been elected. The current government was selected by the EPRDF Central Committee and the Council of EPRDF. And then you can question if that council represents the will of the Ethiopian people. Well, that's open for debate at least. But they had a reform agenda, true, in the sense that the reform agenda driven by the Cairo protest movement and the farmer protest movement in particular, which led to then the coming of power of Abiy Ahmed in EPRDF and then the new government he established then in December 2018 with the Prosperity Party government. Also then proclaiming at that time, yes, reformist agenda and accountability for accountability, transparency for political processes and the respect of human rights and democratic values and all that. Well, to evaluate the performances, that's up to the Ethiopian populace to evaluate the performances of their government if they have achieved what they promised or not. And of course, the best way to evaluate that is through the ballot box, if that is possible to organize. Other than that, it is up for a political discourse to criticize or to praise the government where they do well and to criticize where they do not that well. As a foreigner, as an observer, and as a researcher on Ethiopian politics, of course, I have my views on it, which have been communicated and will be communicated through mostly academic publications. The most recent developments, of course, makes me very worried that the full transition agenda of liberalization as presented in 2018 may not be fulfilled. So, and particularly if the country slides back to a more domestic conflict scenarios as we see on the horizon now. If a country is in conflict, if a country is in war, it is impossible to liberalize and democratize. That's it. Then it is the coercive policies which rules, and that is not liberalization.
Any final thoughts as we find ourselves in a very precarious situation?
Yes, it's to hope for that the political leaderships all across Ethiopia, at the federal level and regional levels, will take a step back and start to de-escalate the conflict rhetoric in order to create room where it is a possibility to start political dialogue. To start political dialogue, to find a trajectory towards a peaceful resolution for these very contested issues Ethiopia is facing.
Kjetil Trovvoll, thank you very much for this very informative analysis.
Thank you for inviting me, Mika.
Well, we have come to the end of the interview, and this is goodbye from me and the technical crew.